Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, all about the trends, challenges and opportunities shaping the financial and banking sectors, not just in Africa, but here in South Africa as well. I'm your host, Michael Avery, and today we're tackling one of the most critical issues for Africa's future, infrastructure development. Now, across the continent, there's roughly $100 billion annual shortfall in infrastructure financing. But the real challenge isn't about finding the money. It's really about making projects bankable and then aligning those projects with the needs of a really rapidly changing continent. From healthcare to energy, agriculture, roads, ports, rail. Think about it. Strategic infrastructure investments are actually key to unlocking Africa's growth potential. Well, today I'm joined by a true expert in the space, Asanda Tsotsi, who's head of project and export finance at Standard Bank CIB. Asanda has been at the forefront of infrastructure finance, writing extensively on how innovative models, ESG-linked incentives, as well as public-private partnerships can hopefully transform key sectors and also unlock this infrastructure puzzle for us, because it feels like we've been talking, Asanda, welcome to the podcast, about infrastructure and its potential for decades now without us really fully seeing the benefits yet.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I think you're quite right. We've talked quite a bit about infrastructure, but, we are still behind where we would like to be. I mean, as you mentioned in your intro, the African continent runs $100 billion shortfall in infrastructure execution, annually. And so this is proving really a big hindrance to things like job creation, poverty alleviation, as well as the reduction of inequalities. And so infrastructure is really critical, and really would like to see some more action being taken to ensure that it comes to fruition.
As we feel every day in South Africa and have for the last 15 years on the energy front, we're now starting to feel that when it comes to water infrastructure, which is the next big crisis, it seems to follow on also from what we've seen in our rail and ports. But before we talk about how we address some of the bankability and the financing issues, maybe you can tell us what exactly your day job entails at Standard Bank CIB.
Thanks, Michael. So look, it varies day to day, but ultimately what we do is we look to finance non-recourse as well as limited recourse project finance transactions. So really that is cash flow lending to a major infrastructure projects. So that would be in the oil and gas as well as the power and infrastructure spaces. We do also look at transactions with export credit agency finance cover. So where ECAs participate to risk mitigate, these large infrastructure projects. So day to day for us is really about driving Africa's growth, and we do that by investing in her infrastructure.
And kicking the bricks of those bankability prospects, which we're going to get into. Now, despite there seeming, it doesn't seem to be a capital availability issue. I think one of the central challenges, and you highlighted in many of your thought leadership pieces, is the difficulty in making projects bankable. Could you explain what makes a project bankable in the context of Africa, and what role do risk mitigation strategies play in then securing financing for these projects?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. As you rightfully say, the availability of capital is not the issue. I think, if we look at sovereign wealth funds, we look at pension funds, there's around $100 trillion of assets under management that sits with those funds. If you look at a recent McKinsey report, there's about $550 billion that is available to be invested in Africa. And you can even take that to South Africa. I mean, our institutional investors are sitting on around 4 trillion rands of assets under management. So the capital is there. The main challenge, there's two main challenges. The first is that our governments are just not spending enough on infrastructure. So the Chinese government spends 7.7% of GDP on infrastructure. India spends 5.2% of GDP on infrastructure. In Africa, we're currently spending around 3.5% of GDP on infrastructure, and we need to increase that to around 7.1% to tackle this issue. But the elephant in the room, as you've mentioned, is really bankability. There's a lot of projects that developers are looking to get off the ground, but critically, some of those projects are not bankable. And what do we mean by bankability? There's a couple of things. So the first part really just talks to the viability of the project. And, we look at that at three different levels. So firstly, at the economic level, is this project able to repay the debt that it has taken out to develop the project? So that's the first piece of it. Does it generate sufficient cash flow? The second piece then relates to what we refer to as social viability. Does this project address the needs of the communities, or is it a vanity project? Now, there are projects that would maybe not contribute directly to communities, but they will contribute to the fiscus in terms of tax receipts or foreign currency earnings, which are then ultimately plowed back into communities. So that's a critical piece for us. The third one on viability is really around the environment. Do these projects meet the World Bank Equator Principles as well as the IFC performance standards? So do they meet the requirements as it relates to protection of the environment? And then we also look at the project developers. What is their track record in developing similar projects? Because those people are going to be critical in constructing this project and eventually, I guess, operating it. And it is critical that, they have the capacity as well as skills to do that. The last one is really around regulatory as well as the regulatory framework in country. Does it support the types of projects that are being developed?
So, there's a lot to unpack there. Let's just start with cash flows because, there's cash flows and there's cash flows. You look at Eskom, for example, it's really battling with outstanding debtors, many municipalities owing Eskom. So what do banks consider or look for when assessing the reliability and the predictability of a project's cash flows? And how important there are long-term contracts or offtake agreements in securing funding?
Very critical, Michael. So, offtake agreements or certainly an underpin of that project, I think, is critical to make it bankable. And so the point that you make, certainly in the projects that we are looking at, the offtake contracts are critical. So they need to kind of match the tenor of the debt. They need to be robust as well. So offtakes are actually very critical.
Absolutely. And then if you look at that, then developing the capital structure, how do you then evaluate the balance here between debt and equity? Is there an ideal mix that makes a project more bankable?
Yeah. So if you talk to bankers on this one and you talk to developers, you're going to get very different answers. But traditionally, what we've seen is, anywhere between 70-30. To what we are seeing in REAP, for instance, in South Africa today, closer to 90-10. But obviously, REAP, you do have a sovereign guarantee that backstops the obligations of Eskom. And so the critical piece, I guess, is something that you said earlier, is the predictability of cash flows really then determines where we play within the debt equity threshold. But obviously, if we are taking market risk in a structure, we're probably going to be around 70-30, maybe even 65-35, depending on the project.
Very interesting that, and understand fully why you would get different answers depending on who you're speaking to in the ecosystem. But, the REAP program was certainly an example of a very successful, certainly the first few rounds, and what we're seeing now, public-private partnership. We had all of that, we had the regulatory certainty, we had the right mix, we had a very clear social impact and lots of certainty created around that until a certain Eskom leadership team started to interject themselves. But that's history now. When you look at, because what we want to do is ensure that we create this environment where we can turn South Africa in particular into a building site, what role do the project sponsors play in making a project bankable? Because often you need a sponsor, someone with a track record to really drive a project forward.
Yeah, and project sponsors are really critical. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot that is required of them in developing these projects. And so they need to be very experienced in developing such projects, I think it becomes very difficult to get into a multi-billion transaction where the sponsors, lack that expertise to undertake the project. So project sponsors are very critical. Also, the other piece that's critical from project sponsors is their ability to raise the equity investment that is required in the project. And so that is, apart from assessing their technical capability, you also want to understand their ability to put in equity capital when things are maybe not going well. Obviously, projects don't tend to develop, although we want them to develop in a linear line, but there are sometimes things that come up that require equity to come in. And so you want sponsors that have the requisite financial standing as well as technical expertise.
I've never seen a project go over time or over budget in an Excel spreadsheet, yet it happens all the time in practice. And, to your point, why you need that resilience, that strength, that experience and financial ability to absorb things that can often go wrong and get derailed in a project. Do you see enough of that in the local market? Is it something we need to think about developing? I know we had it prior to the 2010 World Cup. Since then, many of the major EPC players, the big construction firms, have gone belly up. I think Basil Reed, Business Rescue, that kind of thing. Or do we just rely on global providers to come in and do the projects for us?
Yeah, Michael, you raise a very good point. I think pre-2010, we had a very vibrant construction sector. And obviously, I think of late, it has really struggled, that sector. I think it's important that we are mindful, of the jobs that sector creates within South Africa. And so to the extent that we can, we want to support local contractors. But obviously, also the world is now, it's a global village, so to speak. And so we are seeing international contractors coming into markets, but they come and they bring the, pinnacle in terms of technical skill set, which will ultimately improve our own sector. But I would say it is important that we do still see some of the South African construction players and support them where we can, even though, some of the players are going through, what I would call difficult times at the moment.
Yeah, and it also comes back to visibility over a pipeline of work. And I want to come back to the second point that you raised around social viability and then linking that to environmental sustainability, because I think, and this is just my perspective, we've got the balance just slightly out of kilter. Looking at the way we've handled our offshore oil and gas, in the Orange Basin and Brillpadda, and we've had some very recent high-profile exits for now. And, the question is, yes, obviously there are environmental concerns. Everything has to be done in a way that minimizes any environmental harm. But the social impact in terms of creating industries and new jobs, the boost to the fiscus in terms of improving our balance of trade and less reliance on imported fuels, certainly oil and gas, that didn't seem to be weighed effectively in trying to bring that resource into account. I mean, just looking back, is there anything that you think we could have done differently through that process?
Again, you raise a very important point. We have to have a balance. And balance is maybe not the right word, but we have to look at the social impact of these projects equally as we do the environmental. And so my assertion is that, no one is above the other, and we have to balance those interests. I think in some cases, I've seen it go the other way, where environmental considerations have not been taken into account at all, and all that has been looked at is maybe the economic returns. And also there's been the other side where, it's just the environmental concerns that have been looked at, but not the social concerns. So I would say one of the things that we certainly believe in is that there is a balance that you can find between those two. So they're not mutually exclusive, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
You can do both, or you can do all three. So you can have economic returns, you can benefit society, you can improve the environment as well. And so that's one of the things that I think we need to get better at. So all voices, I think, are important. The issue is when one voice becomes, more important than other voices is kind of where we get it wrong. But where we are balanced, across the requirements, then we tend to get the right outcomes.
And then you can also tap into this growing pool of available capital in the ESG space. And you've mentioned the growing importance of ESG-linked incentives and innovative financing models. You've got green bonds and sustainability-linked loans. How are these models evolving, and how can they be more effectively utilized to help close some of the infrastructure funding gap across critical sectors like water and energy in South Africa?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we sometimes have looked at ESG requirements with suspicion. And the argument that I make is that actually we shouldn't. We should embrace the ESG requirements because, these are an opportunity for us as a continent to leapfrog our infrastructure challenges. It's an opportunity for us to build a climate resilient infrastructure that will ensure that, we don't have a situation where 118 million poor Africans are subjected or, will bear the consequences of adverse weather conditions. I was reading something the other day that close to 700 million of us as Africans, we are going to be displaced in the future because of water scarcity. And so this is really an important aspect that I think we need to make sure that we tackle. I agree with you that, we've seen the use of green bonds. We've seen the use of sustainability linked notes. And for me, there's a lot happening in the ESG space. I'm probably not an expert to talk about it all, but things like blended finance are coming in there. We're seeing carbon finance coming in. Standard Bank did a very nice transaction with cook stoves in that regard. And so, I do like where the ESG market is moving. It continually evolves, but really we should see it as an opportunity as a continent to actually get our infrastructure where it needs to be. And at the same time, we kind of then mitigate, some of the climate challenges that face us.
700 million could be displaced due to, water issues. I was in Namibia recently in Windhoek, and one of my hosts has a farm just 250 km north of Windhoek, talking about this 100-year drought that Namibia is experiencing. And, it really is quite desperate. And I know Namibia is a natural kind of dry to desert country, but you almost get a glimpse into the future there. And I think many in Cape Town will be only too aware of living on the edge of day zero. So how do we collaborate better for risk sharing? Many of the issues that you've addressed, I think many would nod in appreciation of and agree with, but where I think we failed in our approach so far in South Africa in particular is to build effective public-private partnerships. There are a handful. You look at the reprogram, you look at some of our tolling projects, Gautrain, all of those. What lessons can we learn from those successful PPPs to better foster trust between government and the private sector to kickstart infrastructure?
And I think that's a first thing, Michael, is that we need to build the level of trust between the public and the private sector. I think we do look at each other, with suspicious eyeballs, but that's one of the things that we actually need to put aside. I think most governments find themselves in a very challenging fiscal situation, where they need to spend more on the social net or building the social net. And so you need the private sector to come in and through public-private partnerships, and tackle the challenge of the infrastructure deficit. And so the first piece is that we need to build trust between the public and the private sector. The other piece for me is that, the level of skills and graybeards that sit in the private sector, we could better utilize some of those graybeards in the public sector, utilizing their experience of developing projects or getting projects to financial close in tougher jurisdictions than South Africa. We don't utilize that experience enough, would be my view. And also just really talking to each other within the public sector, just two entities talking to each other about infrastructure as opposed to kind of walking in separate directions. And also within the private sector, just making sure that we're all coming into this with one voice. That for me, I think is going to make the most amount of change here. But if we continue to distrust each other, I think we're going to continue to have a scenario where we are only spending 3.5% of GDP on infrastructure. But if there's a lot more collaboration, I think that will get us closer to the 7.1% that we need.
Well, it certainly doesn't help to build trust when I hear a certain deputy minister of the DTIC say that pensions are public assets and should be in some way forced to invest in infrastructure. I'm very happy to take my very private pension and invest in a bankable project because I understand the impact that it'll have in unlocking growth and creating a more prosperous and successful and stable South Africa. But comments like that, I think, sadly, are a little bit loose and reckless. When we look at the role of central banks and the cost of capital, I've been quite critical of the overly hawkish approach of our own Reserve Bank. Letsetja Kganyago is an absolute professional. I think the bank is beyond reproach, should remain independent 100%. But under Governor Jill Marcus, the real inflation rate was closer to 3%. The difference between repo and prime, and we're now closer to 7%. Given the grinding unemployment and poverty and the desperate need to stimulate infrastructure funding, do you think our central bank could be slightly more in tune with the needs of South Africa? I sometimes get a feeling that the SARB thinks it's managing a developed economy.
I sympathize with Michael. There's a lot of, I guess, competing needs that they are thinking about. And so I really sympathize with the tough decisions that they have to make. And so what I would say is, all of us, I think there's more that we can do in this. I think the SARB certainly, from my perspective, I'd like to see a little bit more in, I guess, incentives to invest in infrastructure. So reduction in the capital consumption in putting our money away for, north of 20 years. So my point would be that there's certainly a lot more that can be done. It's not just the SARB. I think if you look at the banks, if you look at developers, government, all of us, I think there's more that we can do to get this infrastructure investment going.
Just lastly, Asanda, if you were to gaze into your crystal ball and look ahead 10 to 20 years, what are your predictions for Africa's infrastructure development? What key sectors or regions do you believe will lead the way, and what systemic changes will need to happen for that to occur?
Yeah, this is like asking me which is my favorite child, Michael. So actually, interestingly, today I find myself in Dar es Salaam, and coming into the hotel, Tanzania has invested a lot in the standard gauge rail. So I think now we're sitting at around phase 7 of that. And they've started operating it now between Dar and Morogoro. And, for me, East Africa, I think, carries a lot of potential on the infrastructure side. And certainly a place like Tanzania is going to be critical. I think Kenya the same. I look at what Ethiopia is, thinking around a new airport, Uganda as well. So I would say, not to pick on anyone, but I think East Africa is really, there's a big infrastructure opportunity here. I think you also see the same in West Africa, right? Whether it's Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, unfortunately, we have some challenges there around credit, but, there's certainly a lot of opportunities. And even then coming to a place like Angola, which has been investing in infrastructure now for what seems like a long time, and all the way down to the south. So I think all the markets, to me, are interesting. I certainly think that over the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see a lot more infrastructure development coming out of the continent as a whole, rather than just one specific region. I think the good thing about pathfinders is that they find a path for us to follow. And so my sense is that, most countries on the continent will be on that, I don't want to say train, but will be on track.
Well, that is hugely encouraging, Asanda. And as I like to say, in East Africa, it's not going pole pole. It's not going slowly when it comes to infrastructure. It is actually ratcheting it up, but in fact, all over the continent. And I think that is the really exciting space we find ourselves in. If we continue along this path, if we continue to have all of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, the funding, the blended finance, the ESG funding, regulatory certainty, building local capacity, and then just executing on these, just imagine what Africa could look like for our children and our children's children as well. And that's really what drives me very forward in a continent that I absolutely love. Asanda Tsotsi, thank you very much. Been a great pleasure having you on this episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast. Take care.
Thank you, Michael. Goodbye.
Well, we've explored some complex yet vital topics today, from how to make infrastructure projects more bankable to the importance of collaboration across sectors and how some ESG considerations are shaping the future of investment in Africa. Thank you as always to our listeners for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Join us next week for more conversations on the banking trends that are shaping the future. Until then, I'm Michael Avery and this has been the Monocle Banking Podcast. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay tuned.